Well, this is Dave Gaddis, and today is the 20th of January, 2015, and today we're interviewing Sara Jane White at her home in Sugar Land. So, welcome, Sara Jane.
Thank you.
Why don't we start at the very beginning and tell us when and where you were born?
Well, I was born in 1936 in Waco, Texas.
In Waco, okay. And did you live there your entire childhood?
No, my parents, this was at the end of the Depression, and while my dad's family had been there for a number of generations, it was time to seek his livelihood elsewhere, and so at 9 months he took my mother and me to San Antonio.
Okay. And what did
And
your
I
father
lived
do?
there. My father was in the lumber business after World War II as started the larger developments, and some of the small retail lumber dealers were being passed up. He also started being a home builder as well as a lumber dealer, and then helped some of the young men coming back from the war get into the business. He would select men that he thought would do well, good character and all of that, and he'd give them some early financing, and some of them went on after he'd mentored them and exceeded him in terms of their achievements in home building. But he was a lumber dealer and home builder in San Antonio.
Did you go to high school in San Antonio?
I did. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And graduated there?
I did, Alamo Heights.
And then where did you go from there?
Well, I went to Incarnate, I'm sorry, no I didn't, not yet. I went to Mary Washington at the University of Virginia for 2 years.
Okay.
I had selected sociology for my major, and historically that was an interesting time too, because it was right a year, I guess, before the Brown decision. So I got interested with the head of our sociology department and a couple of other students, and we started going to little meetings. This black dentist, lovely elderly man by then, would pick us up, and we'd go to meetings and talk, have dialogue about how can we contribute to making this a smooth transition with, so that was kind of something early. And then I married after 2 years, and delayed my education for I think about 13 years, and went back at that point to Incarnate Word.
Okay.
And,
so how did you get to a college in Virginia from San Antonio?
Well, I'll tell you the truth of it, part of the truth of it. It was sort of some of the girls, and this is so far back, it's ancient history, but some of the girls would go away to school, and so that wasn't too unusual. But also I was going with who would become my first husband, who was a midshipman. And Mary Washington in Fredericksburg, Virginia, was not a very far bus drive over to be a drag, as they call the dates, at Annapolis. And so I would get on that bus, and also Mary Washington had unlimited weekends. We didn't, some of the girls' schools over there were more strict. And so I'd get my little things together and go to what they called a drag house, where a lot of the old homes. Annapolis, a great place, early history and planning. Well, maybe I got the bug there, but stay in an old home that some, homeowners would do that and have the girls on the weekend stay with them and date the midshipmen. So that's how I got to Mary Washington. Frankly, I did have an interest in higher education, and thought maybe I'd be a social worker.
Okay. And then I guess you were a Navy wife for?
I was a Navy wife, lived in California for a couple of years, or actually the first 4 years he was gone to the Far East for about half of that time. And when he would go, I was 19 when I married, so I would come home to Mama and Dad, and then go back when he would come back. So, but I lived out there too, also about 2 years. Off and on, 4 years off and on, but together it was about that much time.
Okay, and at some point in time you wanted to go back to school and finish?
I did, so fast forward about 13 years, and I went to Incarnate Word, finished my degree, and actually I had gone to school in California a little bit, but then I got pregnant, and so I started having my family and had the 3 children. Didn't go back, but I had gone to then Long Beach State College, and it became a part of the Southern
It's now Cal State Long
Cal
Beach.
State. And you know, enjoyed it, did fine, but I, you know, made my first priority after starting the family, and
So what was your degree in from incarnate word?
sociology. And I applied to the Worden School of Social Work, and I had been accepted. I was waiting to hear about, with 3 small children who were also going to go to college. I wanted some, you know, help if it was available. And I had not heard from them on that. In the meantime, Sister Winifred, well, actually she was Sister Mary John, and then she later on, or maybe about not too long after that, became Winifred Murray. She left the order, but stayed with the school as a professor. But anyway, at this time she was still Sister Mary John. And she directed me over to Trinity, where Dr. Earl Lewis was just starting a program in urban studies. Trinity had this, you know, vision of having this to offer because we were in the midst of the urban crisis with the riots in Detroit and the different things happening. And it was a response to that to try to provide an interdisciplinary education to help young people get involved in changing things in the community to help solve these problems.
So this was mid to late 60s?
Well, the late 60s. Late 60s when I started, I think 68 when I started at Incarnate Word, and then graduated in 70, and 70 to 72 at Trinity to earn my master's in urban studies.
Okay. So you're a newly minted master's candidate?
Yes,
so
in
what
urban
do you do
studies rather than social work. Well, because of that angle of my interest, we were very fortunate in those days. The Trinity, Dr. Lewis, placed all of us for our internship. We received a stipend for it, and so I wanted to go to Head Start, be an administrator, whatever. I had taught a little kindergarten when my youngest child was in kindergarten. That's about the experience of my career involvement up to that point, was a year or two of kindergarten. But anyway, so I wanted to do Head Start. And he was unable to get me a place in Head Start, and he was pretty unhappy about that. But he did get me internship at the Community Welfare Council, which was a planning arm of the United Way. So I spent my internship time there, and when I finished, I don't think I was the source of any decision making, but the United Way, however it happened, they abolished the Community Welfare Council, and the planning function went back into United Way, and I was noticing several of my friends had gotten nice jobs at the city of San Antonio. So I never did apply to go to United Way. I enjoyed my year. I was evaluating social service agencies, and it was interesting. I enjoyed it and did, a good job with it, I think, hope. But anyway, I did go over to city of San Antonio and got a job in their planning department, and the rest is history.
You remember who the planning director was?
Well, Cipriana Guerra, I think. Okay. Cipriana Guerra. Then Bob Hunter overlapped before he was there before I left, and actually Cip may have come. There was another relatively young, middle-aged man that was there first. I can't remember his name. He died suddenly, and I think that if he wasn't planning director, he was my boss when I first got there. But that changed rather rapidly, unfortunately. And Cipriano Guerra is the first director that his name I can recall. There may have been another one in there. But anyway, so I started, and my focus from the beginning was Central City planning, and I moved right along with that, had a wonderful career there. And
what kinds of projects did you do in San Antonio?
Well, I did preparation of planning documents really for the Central City. We had before I got there, there'd been a Skidmore, Owens and Merrill consulting project that laid out a lot of parameters for developing downtown into more exciting and would hold more people for conventions and that sort of thing. There's so much potential there. And so I, kind of started out taking some of that material and writing more action plans kinds of things. Then before I knew it, they had me as the coordinator for the Interagency River Corridor Committee, which was a wonderful opportunity. And the mayor was head of it, and all the heads of the different agencies, from the school district to the COG to the Harris County to the Historic Commission, the San Antonio Conservation, all the agencies, private and public, and civic leaders who were interested in the downtown came together in that to try to do a better job of coordinating and to get familiar with what the vision was and to contribute to the vision. So I managed that, really for the planning department and the mayor's office for most of it. I can't remember now whether it was 3 years or 4 years, but most of the 6 years I was there, it seems to me.
Well, everybody knows the Riverwalk as being this vibrant, tourist mecca. What was the Riverwalk like back then?
Well, it was with the World's Fair there. Mm-hmm. That had been the beginning of opening up the buildings along the river to the river, to have river frontage. Up until then, they had all faced the streets, and you had a lovely park that was built during the Depression, linear park along the river, but you had no activity at all. But with the coming of the fair, the Hemisphere, there were a few buildings that had opened up, and there was a beginning of activity. And so we also, the Riverwalk Commission was part of, obviously they would be and were a part of the Interagency Coordinating Committee. And of course there was a lot of talk and action about to attract more businesses that, in entertainment type restaurants and jazz bands and things like that down there. And so that began to happen with the oversight of the Riverwalk Commission and coordination with the city and the other agencies. The River Authority, that's one that's very important to all of this. So anyway, that started changing. So it became less passive and more active. For years, about the only thing that was on the river was at the corner there where Shiloh's is, and the Casa Rio had, for years, before everything started opening up, you could go to Casa Rio, but that was about it. And so all that was changing, and that change was starting with the Hemisphere, which was before I went to work for the city.
By the way, do you happen to remember who the mayor was back then?
Well, we had Lila Cockrell when I first started with the city, and then Henry Cisneros followed her, and I worked for both of them. And things that I did, particularly when I heard from a friend Al Severa at the COG that there was a new Title IX program in the Economic Development Administration, and that program had within it a program to assist cities with economic development where they were suffering from the impact of Department of Defense cutbacks. Mm-hmm. So he said, heads up. So I said, heads up. And I talked to, goodness, was it Bob Hunter by then or not? Well, it may have been. Bob Hunter may have been there by then. And so he gave his nod for it, and we had a meeting, called the mayor in. And it wasn't all that long a story, but the outcome of that was go ahead, try it. And so I started working on that. I had to get a quick course in economic analysis, cost-benefit analysis and all that, and the multiplier effect to try to show how it would create more temporary jobs, but also more long-term jobs. And so I had if they granted money on the basis of weight, it was, pretty big, a lot of paper there. But also the content was good and important because the flood, our dam, prior to my coming there even, had been declared insufficient to hold back a major flood. And of course, it was built there in the first place because of a flood in the early days. I guess even, well, around, I can't tell you, at least the early 30s, that dam may have been built before that. But it was to hold the water back, which had devastated the downtown of San Antonio at an earlier time and caused many deaths and all. What was the problem was, everybody's familiar with the Riverwalk. And that was apparently originally a natural part of the river, but it choked the water coming downstream. You know, when the water had to do a right turn or a left turn, you know, to take that loop, or the Riverwalk loop. It's not a loop exactly, it's bend. Yeah. And so we had a bad situation. We couldn't get money for other projects when they knew that they could easily be destroyed and in the Skidmore and Merrill report, and we had engineering studies and all to back it up. That had been pointed out that our first priority was that dam. And in the meantime, the Corps of Engineers was telling us, oh, it would be 10, 15 years or whatever, a long time, that we were on their list, but we weren't at the top of it. I'm sure New Orleans was ahead of us. And, so anyway, so off I went with this, and you know, fools rush in where angels fear to trot. And sure enough, we were awarded the grant. Even when the assistant, I can't remember his name, for Henry B. Gonzalez had said, you know, we weren't, don't be disappointed, you're not going to get it. And we got it. And at that time, it was the largest of their grants that had been awarded. It was right at $7 million, and it took care of the dam. Which there was a mixed feeling about that, because the old dam was really pretty, and the only part they could leave were the two entrances, which still reflect the old look of the dam with the lights and the walls, old brick walls. But the dam itself is not aesthetically pleasing, but it is functional, and they did have the flood that would have broken that, fortunately, after the dam was built. So that was a exciting time and a wonderful thing to see happen, and to see now all that's happening since then. That was, in a way, the door was opened by that project.
Okay. And so how long did you end up staying in San Antonio?
I was 6 years.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then where to from there?
Bel Air, city of Bel Air. Mm-hmm.
So, and were you hired just as city planner? Or
yes, I was.
Director, or? Well,
it was the same thing. It was a small community, and they had one planner, and that planner had left. They had just gone through a very difficult time, which I really, when I accepted the job, I didn't know. I had been offered a job about the same time. Doris Davis had interviewed me at the COG, and so I was offered that job, and I was offered the city of Bel Air job. But I had been working for a city, and I had kind of gotten where I loved cities, and it looked like a wonderful little spot to go in and be their planning person, director, head of the office, rather than the larger bureaucracy over at the COG, which I'm sure would have been good too. It was a tough choice. But that's the choice I made. I was already familiar with cities, and urban studies seemed more connected to that.
So this was the late 70s?
78.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And was Bel Air built out at the time, or?
Well, there were still some questions along the loop, which had cut through this little cohesive town some years before, Loop 610. And they had had a lot of controversy over what to do once the loop came through there with the property alongside the loop. And there was a lot of growth pressure and pressure to develop it commercially, and they had approved and done some projects. This had been so disruptive to the cohesiveness of the body politic, you might say, that they had, within 6 months, I didn't know this until I'd already accepted the job. Within 6 months, they had had 3 city councils. They had had the council that was pro-development enough to approve an office development along the loop, which was to follow office developments that had already occurred. And the citizens, I guess a petition and so forth, had a recall election, and they recalled them. And I learned that that was the first time, at least in Texas, if not the United States, that a city council or people on it had been recalled for basically, policy reasons or political reasons or policy. That normally it was only used for malfeasance. But in this case, they recalled, I think maybe one person they didn't recall, but they recalled basically the whole council. So I went in with a new council at that time. And they only had 6 months, though, before the regular elections. And so that new council was in there for 6 months, and I was working for them. And then, boom, they had the regular elections, and they were tossed out. And so we had 3 councils in my first 6 months there. Well, actually, the first council was gone, but they had 3 councils within that short period of time, and I came in on the front end of that. And so we had some challenges. That they were still using an ordinance, development ordinance, zoning basically, from the 50s that Marvin Springer had prepared for them. And they were needing some real help on that. And of course, zoning had not been what I was involved in San Antonio. And so I got busy, learning their zoning ordinance and preparing for the AICP exam to strengthen my credentials. And then I started working very closely with their city attorney, Furman Hickey, who taught me a lot about land use law, which was, of course, very important to know. And so, we put it all together, and and we had at that time Richard Babcock, who people know him. He and an associate, Wendy Seaman, I believe was her last name, I'm not sure. And she was from San Antonio. We didn't know each other there, but we kind of knew some of the same folks. But anyway, they came in to advise us. So I was, there was a learning curve there, and I was learning as fast as I could. Then after they left, we had a lot of good tools to work with and all that, but we still had to put together our ordinance. And I remember working during Christmas late at night to put all of this into an ordinance form. And we put at Furman's advice, we put the comprehensive plan, it was a comprehensive policy plan, at the front of the ordinance. It was adopted by ordinance, so it carried the weight that he thought was necessary for it to have in terms of guiding our growth. And it provided, as best we could, some balance between the needs to protect the residential areas. There were all kinds of provisions to avoid adverse impact, including no access from the commercial plan developments to the neighborhoods. They'd have to go around to do that, and a lot of setback requirements and buffers and and minimum heights and minimum lot coverage and parking. Everything had to be worked out in that plan development. But they could be mixed, or they could be, basically commercial. So we got that all together. And then we had Wayne Duddleson come in. We had this big 18-acre piece of property there at Bel Air and the Loop. And the future of it was, it was at between Furnace and Bissonnet and the Loop, and it was 18 acres as I recall. Anyway, he had a grand plan, and we worked with him and managed to, with his cooperation, make it fit our newly minted for me, ordinance. And so it was approved. But there was still the people in the community that did not want that to happen, and they sued the city for it and went to the state court, Supreme Court. And it was upheld, which was, I think, then helpful for the rest of the state to kind of know what might be possible and what would not be possible. But the timing of it was such that the bottom fell out of the office building economy. We'd overbuilt, and I think the oil slump came along, and so for him, really, in his pocketbook, fortunately, there was this delay, and he had not already gotten underway with it because he backed off of it because there was no more market for that. And what happened was very nice, ultimately, for at least in many ways, it was nice for this community that wanted to be a residential community, emphasize that, and that was their vision. And they brought in that Episcopal school on that 18 acres. And that's, I think, in many ways been an asset, but not for the tax base. and we planners all know you need at least 15% of your land use in commercial to help support your residential as it grow. And that community they had studies out of A&M before I got there that dealt with the decaying infrastructure, and they had a lot of things they needed to do.
Okay. You ended up staying in Bel Air for
10 years.
10 years?
10 years.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Then after that, went on to do consulting work. But during that, the other thing we did during that time, I guess we had one of the early TIF districts in the state.
Okay.
And that was, we seemed to be plugging along pretty well. It was clearly a need and for the downtown, and residents were more, somewhat at least more amenable to thinking in terms of that becoming a more cohesive and attractive town center. And actually, I came up with the idea, and then some engineers took it, and it seemed to work to take Bissonnette comes in at an acute angle to Bel Air. And yesterday I took a sentimental journey back over there, and it's the way it always was. And so instead of that, we were going to swing Bissonnette off at Spruce and make a core area, and then it would come around and create, this town, not a square in terms of all park or anything, but a square core area that would have a grid and not this angle, and it create this lovely space to begin redevelopment. And then on the outside of it, on the south side of Bel Air Boulevard, we had tremendous amounts of easements that were just there. They weren't really used. And then plus the easement or the medians that were there. So that gave, again, the city some leverage to abandon those easements and start getting some new development along there and, accommodate the businesses that are already there as well, try to do all those things. So we got a developer, and the TIF board, which had representation from the various interests in the community, especially downtown, but also the residential, had agreed to this. And the day that city manager and I and the attorney and I guess the head of the TIF board were going to meet with him to iron out an agreement. He died. He was a relatively young man, died of a heart attack, and I can't remember his name. And we never recovered from that. And so the TIF district never did achieve the planning vision that was set out for it, but it did accomplish a few things. We got the Tri-City agreement to do the transit center that is there now, and it improved. That was just an old kind of rundown parking area at the time, and so it improved the situation and improved the Metro's ability for their cross-city transit and so forth. And then we got the post office because we had in the plan the capability to abandon some street right-of-way, and the post office and the council were talking about putting the new post office on the loop. And I thought, well, that doesn't make sense. The post office was the old one was downtown, and so I kind of had a conceptual plan. I knew some people who were wanting to sell their property downtown that had come into my office, so you had that information. So I did a memo to council about it, and they liked it. So that's where we ended up with the post office, a new post office in the downtown area, which would then, and then they did get a big new bank next to that. But by and large, and they got some new landscaping and the transit center. But the grand plan was never met, and yesterday I had an awful hard time with all those streets and angles, and it's hard to negotiate that little downtown area. And
So what made you leave Bel Air?
well, I'd been there 10 years, and I had I guess a bee in my bonnet. Is that the right? I don't know. Anyway, I kind of wanted to go back, and did want to go back, and got accepted at Rice to I wanted to, in a way, to go to A&M to their graduate program in planning, but I was helping Bob. We had his 3 kids that weren't completely out of the nest yet, and or at least the younger one wasn't. Anyway, I felt like, regardless of what my homemaking interests were, I wanted to. I didn't want to have to do that long commute from Sugar Land, and so I took a look at Rice, and I thought, well, this program will fit into my interest by focusing. Well, we had to do all the core subjects of IR and comparative, and which was fun, and American. I focused on state and local government, and then did my thesis on neighborhood organizations. So that was good. And then I thought when I finished that I probably would try to do some teaching, but I was doing consulting all the time I was going to school. And this consulting was still going well. And when I finished, you may recall it, that there was a period where they were cutting back at the University of Houston. Some things had been going on, and it really, I did a little looking, and later on my professor said, well, why didn't you come back to us, and we could have, helped you with those looks a little bit better. I did some looking for a job and didn't find it, and I was pretty busy with my consulting, so I just kept consulting, and felt that I was still pleased that I'd gotten that. It was wonderful. I was over there counting the 2 years for the dissertation. It was 6 years. So I feel a close attachment to that program and those people. But I never did, and it's a regret, I didn't teach after that. I taught, of course, during that, and then some at the school at Rice, and I had taught at the University of Houston downtown 1 year when I was at Bel Air, and enjoyed it. But again, it was so far from downtown Houston out to here. My father died that year, and so I got someone to take my place the next year, and I'm blocking on her name. It'll come.
So who were some of your clients when you were consulting?
Well, a number of small cities, Stafford, Sugar Land, we mentioned that, Brenham, Alvin, Clear Lake. I've got my list there I gave you. Rosenberg, the city of San Antonio, the downtown, I've got the correct name for it, the downtown district organization. I did a study for them. So some big, and then Roberta Burris hired my little firm to do some work on the Third Ward Development Plan. We enjoyed that and put together a plan that I had told her about that. She hadn't realized that it was, they had a copy of it with some other related architectural work on restoration of some of the little row houses in the Third Ward in the Contemporary Art Museum. And I saw it one day. I said, Roberta, you know this. So anyway, a lot of small cities, the project over in Katy and Webster, and but mostly, mostly the small cities at that time, but a few big city projects. City of San Antonio, we did a overhead LDS, Llewellyn Davies Sonny was the lead on that, but I did work on that. It was airport district planning with the overlay district.
For the smaller cities, you were mainly doing?
Comp
plans, plan review.
Exactly, and analysis, land use analysis, and
okay.
and writing ordinances. I wrote ordinances, and when I would do the ordinances, I would always either Alan Taylor or Furman Hickey, or in the case of Stafford, they had on their, they used Olson, and so I would make sure that they were try to have everybody happy with, with the strength of it from a legal standpoint, as well as the quality from a land use standpoint.
Let's go back. You mentioned when you first came to Bel Air that you were studying for your AICP exam.
I did.
And so let's go back even further. And when did you first get involved with APA or ASPO or AIP, or what was your first involvement with the professional organization?
Well, in San Antonio, but I had not gotten real involved. I was just brand new and went to a few meetings. It was, I believe, AIP then, was it not?
Okay.
And so I'm a charter member of APA. Mm-hmm. Is when I got here, what a huge help. I knew I needed all the help I could get going into a completely different piece of planning. As we all know, it's a rather broad, a lot of different ways you can be involved.
And other than going to the meetings, did you get involved in the local section?
I did, and after a year or two, or three, while I was at Bel Air, I'll put it that way, I did become the director. Mm-hmm. And so certainly I was, involved in and enjoyed it before that, and was kind of, surprised. And then that put me on the state board. Mm-hmm. And of course I remember your being the environmental department chair on our state board during that time, way back, and on the state board. Then when I was chapter president, we were still doing things formative. We added the Northwest section. Remember that?
Okay.
Yeah, and Bob Wegner. He was such great support because we didn't have. That's another thing throughout most of what I've been talking about. We didn't have all the high-tech tools that we have now, and so he put out a physical newsletter for us, and we did as a board when I was chairman. We had realized we'd never really set out a specific plan of action for like a 5-year plan, and we worked on that, and then the newsletter was a big help in kind of holding things together, and so many people did so many things.
Do you remember some of the people who were on the chapter board at the time?
Well, of course, you were, and I think Bob Wegner was, David Pugh. Oh, goodness, a lot of... I was trying to think of women on the board at that time. Well, of course, Mary Lou I have a cousin named Harry Lou. Mary Lou had been chapter president before me, and she wasn't on the board then, but she was still active at the local level and had input when she needed to and wanted to. And so... And so you were... it was Kent Marsh. I think he might... Yeah, anyway, we had a good board.
And you were chapter president in the 80s? Do you remember the years?
Maybe 85 to 87,
okay.
Maybe.
Okay.
I've got it on that resume. Where's there it is. In that period, yeah.
Do you remember who was president right before you?
Yeah, wait a minute. Craig. It was Craig Farmer.
Craig? Okay.
I think maybe it was.
Okay.
No, it wasn't. I don't think it was. But Craig was on the board.
Yeah, okay.
Goodness, I'm blocking.
That's okay. And one of the things that you, by virtue of you being the state chapter president, is you get to be on the chapter president's council, which is the national group. Do you remember much from that?
Well, yes. I enjoyed, first of all, kind of being in the inner circle of the chapter president's council, meeting presidents from other states, and again, it's always you hopefully provide some input, but you learn a lot too, and more so than that's the biggest advantage, and make friends, and so that was great. And I did serve as the treasurer for whatever it actually kept me on. Our terms were 2 years, right? Mm-hmm. And so at the end of my 2 years, I was I asked her elected to be the treasurer, and I accepted. So I was actually on the President's Council for 2 extra years,
Okay.
and that was fun. And things were changing. Of course, that's when I was by then a consultant and working at school too, and then had some. My son, who was an Aggie, got this highly malignant brain tumor, and so that was a huge thing. And but he survived it and graduated and did well after that for 20 years until it came back. But anyway, so those were good years, busy years, kind of doing a lot of different things.
And when did you finally finish consulting? When did you?
Well, actually, I kind of closed my last books on it the early part of '05.
Okay.
Right after John's death, as I mentioned earlier, and wanted to devote myself to family matters.
Okay. One of the things that we've been asking people, particularly early women planners, is did you ever run across any gender discrimination, or do you think things have changed at all? Or?
Well, yeah, I think that I didn't pay a whole lot. I probably did a little bit. It was unusual to have women, but I felt, my feeling was always that if you expect to be respected, and then you will be. So I wasn't looking for trouble. Maybe I was fortunate. I had a really great dad, and he so I didn't really feel much. I didn't lose sleep over that issue.
Okay.
Put it that way.
You kind of fell into planning kind of by circumstance. If you were going to give some advice to a young planner, what would it be?
Well, I would want them to go for it. I think it's a great place to have a career. I liked it because it is a place where colleagues and teamwork are so important, and so you meet a lot of people. The people you work with, both citizens and staff and colleagues in the field, who bring new ideas that you haven't heard about, because especially when you're one person in that's the planner, and like I was in Bel Air, it's invaluable to have both the professional affiliation and the career. For somebody who likes challenges and likes people and wants to leave the place they are a little better than they found it if they can. It's a great career. Go for it. Girls and women and men, all of it's wonderful.
So you started out your career in sociology, trying to change society. Do you feel like you were a success?
Well, maybe I feel like I've made a few positive contributions along the way, but a lot of other people have been a part of that.
And so, at some point in time, you became a fellow of the AICP?
Oh, yes.
You want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, that was wonderful. I guess the peak honor of my career to be recognized like that, and I owed it to a lot of colleagues who knew and supported me, and it was a great honor, and I hope that I have, in some ways, lived up to it.
Well, you've had a great, successful career. Can you look back and think of any mentors that really helped shape your career?
Well, goodness, yes. From the beginning in San Antonio, there were, I'll put Bob Hunter in that category, a gentleman named Darrell Engel, who was, I worked a lot with him on the downtown. He was he was an architect and taught architecture, but also was the urban design planner. And so what he did and what I was doing to pull together the plans and priorities for downtown, he put life to it all. He did illustrations, and we did a wonderful manual. And you know, give him more credit. I pulled it together and put the text in there, but the concepts came from him and were illustrated by him. And a couple of years after I had left left San Antonio, was working for Bel Air. I was in Austin for some kind of meeting, and some fellow I didn't know from San Antonio opened his briefcase, and there was that document that we had done. So that it's nice to see plans used, not put on the shelf. So those two, oh goodness. Gil Fernandez, Al Cervera, who tipped me off on that Almas Dam plan, and he was, a colleague in other ways because of our common planning interests. Of course, I went through a lot of A95 reviews there at ACOG. And Doris Davis, what a wonderful friend and colleague she's been through the years. We went to China together on a planning and architectural trip with some other people. That was a wonderful experience. And oh goodness, how about you, David? You were wonderful, and so important on the board that when I was chapter president and beyond, and up to this day. My goodness, look what you're doing now.
Yeah. Well, how about the other direction? How about proteges or people that maybe you have mentored that you're particularly proud of?
Well, I feel like that certainly women. I can remember after when I was, but I don't remember who this woman was. It was at the conference when I was, I guess, making my first speech as the chapter president, and she came up and told me how much she appreciated it and how that was an inspiration to her. And but I know they're perhaps Ann Bagley. But what I like to see is if I mentored one person or another, such as Ann Bagley, that it's always nice when the student excels the teacher. So I would put all my mentoring in that category, I think. But
I don't know, you've set a pretty high standard. So.
Well, and the lady that took my place at Bel Air, I mentored her a good while. Dana Campbell. Dana Campbell. Okay. And she came from a building background, and so I stayed on as a consultant in Bel Air for 2 to 4 years, and so I was, mentoring her as a part of that process. And that was the intent to do that. But anyway.
By the way, did you have the same city manager at Bel Air the whole time?
No. We had Dave Doty, and then we had, I think his name was a lot of Daves. Dave Harner, I believe. His first name was Dave. And then we had King Cole. And they were all really great. And again, in many ways, my coming into a small city and that environment as opposed to the situation I had in San Antonio, they too, all of the city managers, I would say, were mentors to me.
Okay.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of territory. Is there something you want to talk about that we haven't talked about?
Well, I would just say thank you very much for this opportunity to have a conversation with you and our larger community. I feel, I love to feel the connection. And many of the planners that come to mind, I'll be thinking of for the next few days that I didn't mention. And did we mention Mike McAnally? Certainly, and many that Kent Marsh was, and of course we've mentioned Mary Lou.
Well, Well, you
on and
mentioned
on it goes.
before we started, since your retirement, you've been doing some traveling. And
Yes, I've traveled and enjoyed that. We went on 2 trips this past year, one to Newfoundland with another couple that have been friends for 40 years or more. And then we went on this Viking River cruise to Normandy from Paris, and that was fabulous. And I work, do some volunteer work with an organization called Fertile Ground that is run by a gentleman named Gary. I'm sorry. Well, I want to say Gary Haynes, but that's not right. But anyway, he takes in ex-offenders, and it's a real nice, wonderful program that helps them get their feet back on the ground and move out into the community. And then, so I do some volunteer work, other mentoring. I've mentored in the junior school for the last 4 years. I'm not doing it this year, and then some things in my church, a Stephen minister, and I just published a book. I mean, it's being published right now.
Well, tell us about that.
Well, I wrote it and self-published it, if you will, in about 07, and it was about to run out of copies. And I just accidentally met this gentleman. I was leaving Barnes & Noble with books I'd been buying for Christmas presents, and this gentleman in front of me kind of stumbled over the threshold a little bit. I said, "Oh, are you okay?" And he said, "Oh, yes, I'm fine." And so we started talking a little bit, and turns out, long story short, he had a small publishing company of his own, although he was backing off from that. But I sent him a book, and he loved it. And so, just at the time I'm running out of books and just trying to decide what to do, he has had connections with the publisher in College Station. So the book is being published. It'll be on, I guess, ebooks, Amazon, and then Barnes & Noble, and produced on, I'm learning things about publishing, POD, produced on demand. In other words, I won't have to get a whole bunch of copies and pay for them in advance.
And the name of the book?
The book is John's story, Through the Valley and Beyond, and it's about this very unusual story of my son John, who was not supposed to survive but perhaps a year with the best treatment they had available back in '83, and he was able to go on and finish college after 5 years, and he just thought, well, I'm doing pretty well. He married and had 2 beautiful girls, and had a career, allied career, and his major was petroleum engineering, but he ended up in the field of environmental engineering. And anyway, he was with Weston for so it's his story, which is a lot more to it than that, but anyone who would like a copy within a week or 2, they could probably get it on ebooks.
And what did your other 2 kids end up doing?
Oh, yes. Well, one is an artist. She is a Dallas artist, and she can be Googled, Sally Warren. And the other is insurance person with Wortham, and their San Antonio office. It used to be Eichlitz, Dennis, and Ray. And he is also, he loves music, and started with a friend a festival near Wimberley at Fisher Hall in the Hill Country. And it's been going for 10 years. And this year they changed the name and had their festival in October. And I think they have another one in the spring. It was the Rice Festival, and now it's the Fisher Festival. And so that's one of his claims to fame, other than being in the insurance business. And of course, he loves baseball, and his 2 sons have been varsity baseball players in their college days, and he's run baseball camps every summer. I think he's still doing it in San Antonio to serve the whole community.
But no planners or public officials?
No planners or public officials. Yeah.
Well, I want to appreciate you taking the time to visit with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. You too, Christiana.
Okay.